Some stories don't die. They wait, quietly, like dust resting on forgotten pages. And sometimes, they call us back. For 60 years, Thomas Miller stayed away from the town where his life changed forever. There was a night he never spoke about. A night when the woman he loved simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but a locked door, a cold silence, and a garden overflowing with roses he never touched again. Neighbors whispered. Friends stopped asking. And Thomas carried the weight of that night like a ghost clinging to his shadow. No one knew why she disappeared. No one knew why the garden, once vibrant, blooming with impossible color, was left to wither in the dark. And Thomas? He never explained a thing. Not the silence, not the roses, not the emptiness that settled into his life from that moment on. Until now. But memories have a strange way of resurfacing. Some return as whispers, others as warnings. On a quiet evening, inside a small flower shop, Thomas sees something he can't ignore. A pair of hands arranging a bouquet of roses, the same shade he once used to confess a love that was never returned. A shade that should have meant everything, yet somehow tore two people apart. The girl behind the counter knows a name he hasn't spoken in decades. A name tied to a truth, buried deeper than time, deeper than grief, and darker than he ever imagined. Why did Eleanor disappear the night he proposed? Why did she leave without a word? And why, after all these years, does her garden still bloom as if it remembers him? In the heart of that garden lies a secret. One color, one mistake, one moment that changed everything. This is the story of a love lost, a truth concealed, and the single color that destroyed them both. Thomas Miller had always enjoyed the quiet rhythms of small towns, but after decades living in the restless pulse of the city, he hadn't imagined he would ever return. At 65, retired, and with a life free of obligations, he found himself driving along winding roads toward the lake town where he had spent some of his youth. There was no pressing reason, no unresolved business, no invitations, no appointments. He simply wanted to wander through streets he remembered only faintly, and most of all, find the roses he had always admired, the kind that had captivated him decades ago. The air was crisp and fragrant after a recent rain, carrying hints of wet pine, earth, and distant smoke from a wood fire. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the familiar streets. Thomas drove slowly, letting his eyes drift over the subtle changes. A newly painted shop sign, a roof replaced, a lamppost leaning a different way. Somehow, everything felt familiar, almost comforting. He parked near the main street and stepped out, stretching slightly as the cool air brushed his skin. The streets were quiet, lined with small shops and cafes. Some had changed, some had not. The sound of a bicycle bell echoed faintly down the road, mingling with the distant lap of water from the lake beyond the trees. Thomas inhaled deeply, savoring the simplicity, the quiet freedom of moving without purpose, the luxury of a life finally unhurried. His steps eventually brought him to a tiny flower shop tucked between two older buildings. Warm light spilled from the windows, illuminating bouquets of every shape and color. Thomas paused, drawn by the quiet joy of seeing the flowers. Not nostalgia, not sentiment, just the pleasure of observing their vivid colors and the careful artistry in arranging each bloom. He loved the way the petals seemed to glow, the delicate scent mingling with the clean air outside. Inside, a young woman held a bouquet of bright red roses, turning each stem with gentle care. Thomas's eyes followed her movements, the tilt of her head, the soft concentration in her expression, the quiet grace in her hands. The roses were striking in the golden evening light, their color vibrant and impossible to ignore. Thomas felt a subtle stirring, a flicker of recognition he couldn't yet name. Like a single quiet chord struck deep in his mind. A small vibration in his chest, light and fleeting. He lingered for a moment, watching the sunlight fall across the petals, breathing in the faint fragrance that mixed with the scent of old wood and soil. Everything felt slower here, more deliberate, yet alive in a way the city never allowed. The young woman adjusted the bouquet, unaware she had awakened something dormant in Thomas. As he stood there, he noticed small details, dust motes drifting lazily in the sunlight, shadows shifting across the wooden floor, the soft creak of shelves as the shop settled around him. His thoughts wandered, first aimlessly, drifting between the streets outside, the soft murmur of distant voices, the cool breeze from the open door. Then, almost imperceptibly, fragments of memory began rising to the surface. Flashes of old afternoons, faint music, laughter in rooms long silent, and somewhere in the back of his mind, red roses. Thomas turned gently, letting the moment linger just long enough to savor it. The young woman, unaware of the connection she'd stirred, continued arranging the bouquet, completely absorbed in her task. And for Thomas, it was enough. A seed had been planted. Memory had begun to whisper. Continuing down the street toward the small house by the lake, Thomas walked slowly, noticing every detail. The worn cobblestones beneath his shoes, the rustling leaves in the evening breeze, the distant cry of a bird returning to its nest. Everything felt amplified, heightened by the awareness that he had returned, that time was folding in on itself in ways he hadn't expected. Arriving at the house, he paused to take in its familiar shape. Chipped paint, rain-streaked windows, a slightly warped porch. Pushing open the creaking door, Thomas stepped inside. The scent of old wood, dust, and faint traces of flowers filled the air. Golden sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting soft patterns across the floorboards and filling the room with a warm, quiet glow. His hands found the piano almost instinctively. The keys were cold under his fingers. The first note sounded brittle, uneven, yet alive. A melody teased the edges of his memory, fragile, insistent. The sound wasn't just music. It was a portal, and through it, the past began to unfurl. He saw her then, a young woman sitting by the window, sunlight catching her hair, fingertips brushing sheet music, lips curved in a gentle, shy smile. The faint echo of laughter rippled through his mind. He remembered small arguments over notes, shared silences, and soft, endless afternoons filled with golden light. Every gesture, every expression returned vividly. Thomas settled into a chair by the window, letting present and past rest side by side. The house was silent except for the gentle lap of water on the shore, the occasional creak of the floorboards, and the rustle of the evening breeze. Somewhere in town, the young woman with the roses was likely still at her work, unaware of the current she had set in motion. And for Thomas, that was enough. Enough to know the past had begun to speak again, gently, insistently. The first note of a long-forgotten melody had been struck. He gazed at the lake as the sun dipped lower, fiery reflections rippling across the water. And there, in the quiet, Thomas allowed the past to fold around him, not with answers, not with certainty, but with a soft invitation to remember, to feel, and maybe, in time, to understand. The memory of that first encounter had never faded. Even after decades, Thomas could still recall every detail: the scent of the late afternoon air, the hum of the city, the way sunlight spilled across the street like honey over stone. He had been walking home from a music rehearsal, violin case slung over his shoulder, his thoughts drifting somewhere between melody and memory. The crosswalk signal glowed red, and a few cars idled patiently, their engines purring. That was when he saw her. A young woman stepped confidently into the street despite the red light. Her bag swung loosely at her side. Her steps were calm, unhurried. Something in the way she moved caught his attention. Not recklessness, but a quiet certainty, as if the world moved at her rhythm alone. Thomas instinctively reached out, catching her wrist before she could take another step. Startled, she turned toward him, her expression calm yet puzzled. "Hello?" she said politely, her voice clear and measured. "Can I help you?" Thomas blinked, frozen for 3 long seconds. Her eyes were the soft brown of autumn leaves, her face radiant beneath the sun. He had imagined meeting someone beautiful before, but never someone who felt both distant and close at once. No," he stammered, flustered. "I just thought the light was red." She tilted her head slightly, curious. "Oh?" she said lightly, then smiled, a simple, graceful curve that disarmed him completely. The cars began to move again, and Thomas realized his hand was still hovering awkwardly near hers. Embarrassed, he stepped back as she crossed safely to the other side of the street. He didn't know it then, but that small, strange moment would stay with him for the rest of his life. They met again a week later, this time inside a small bookstore near the corner of Elm Street. Thomas was browsing through a shelf of poetry when he heard that same voice behind him, asking the clerk if they carried a collection of Chopin's letters. He turned, half in disbelief, and there she was again, Eleanor. It felt natural to speak, as though fate had offered him a second chance. "You like Chopin?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "I love his letters more than his music," she said. "They feel honest." From that day on, they spoke often. Their conversations flowed effortlessly, about music, books, small philosophies about the world. She had a quick wit and a quiet charm, a way of listening that made Thomas feel as if every word mattered. He found himself drawn to her calm confidence and to the gentle precision of her words. They began meeting intentionally. Coffee at the cafe with the chipped tables, walks through the park, evenings by the lake. Sometimes Thomas brought his violin, and she would ask him to play her favorite waltzes. In those moments, he forgot everything else. The world narrowed to the sound of her laughter and the glow of lamplight on her face. One afternoon, they visited the rose garden behind the old library. It was late spring, and the air was thick with fragrance. Rows of roses bloomed in every color, soft pinks, pale ivories, and deep crimson reds that burned beneath the sun. Thomas walked beside her, explaining the names of the varieties, sharing small facts he'd picked up from books. "Red roses," he said, glancing at her, "are for lovers. Blue ones, for friends." Eleanor laughed softly. "Blue roses? I don't think I've ever seen one." "They're rare," he said with a grin. "Almost mythical. Maybe that's why I like them. Symbols of things that can't really exist." She teased him gently. "So if someone gave you a blue rose, you'd know you were just a friend?" He chuckled. "Exactly." She smiled, lifting her face towards the sunlight. "Then I hope you never get a blue one." Her words, playful, tender, lingered in his mind long after. There were countless little moments like that, fragments of days that stitched themselves into memory. Once, she asked him to help fix a small music box that had stopped playing. When she turned the key, nothing happened. "Guess it's broken," she said, laughing. Thomas leaned over, adjusted the latch, and wound it again. Instantly, the melody began, a soft, tinkling waltz. Eleanor looked genuinely surprised. "Oh, I must have done it wrong," he smiled. "Maybe it just needed a gentler touch." He thought nothing more of it then. It was just another ordinary afternoon. Her laughter, the sunlight, the faint scent of roses drifting in from the garden outside. Their love grew in quiet, steady rhythms. They shared dinners, walks, silences. When he composed music, she sat beside him reading, humming along, sometimes off-key, and they would both laugh. It was during one of those soft evenings that Thomas decided. He wanted to spend his life with her. He spent the better part of a week preparing. He visited every flower shop he could find in the city, selecting each bouquet with careful attention, inspecting every stem to make sure everything was perfect. His small apartment filled with flowers, vivid, fragrant, overwhelming in their beauty. Every petal, every leaf was chosen to express the depth and sincerity of his love for Eleanor. Beside the flowers lay the engagement ring, a gemstone cut with precision, engraved with a tiny crown inside it, a quiet but meaningful promise. He checked and rechecked everything: the ring, the flowers, the exact spot where he would kneel. Every detail mattered, as if the whole world hinged on that single moment. Thomas imagined Eleanor's face when she walked in, the sparkle in her eyes, the smile that would bloom across her lips. He pictured her joy, her surprise, the silent understanding between them. Excitement and anticipation surged through him, mingling with love and reverence, an emotion almost sacred. When Eleanor entered, she paused, her expression unreadable. Thomas, nervous but smiling, asked softly, "Do you like it?" She looked around, then at him, and gave a small, polite smile. "They're lovely," she said quietly, but her tone held no warmth. He waited for joy, for surprise, for anything, but nothing came. The silence stretched painfully. She seemed distant, detached. That night, she left early, and by the next morning she was gone. Weeks passed, then months. Eleanor never returned his calls, never replied to his letters. Thomas didn't understand. He had given her everything: his music, his affection, his sincerity. Eventually, he learned she had married a wealthy businessman. Thomas read the news twice, struggling to believe it. A part of him wanted to be angry, to think she had only cared for comfort and status. But perhaps that was easier than facing the possibility that she had never loved him at all. So he buried the pain. He poured himself into music, into teaching, into the quiet rhythm of life. Years later, he met someone kind and dependable. They married, built a life together, and though he grew to love his wife deeply, the ghost of Eleanor never fully left him. As decades passed, the memories softened, but they never disappeared. Thomas occasionally thought back to her small quirks, how she laughed when things didn't work, how she tilted her head at traffic lights, how she smiled that first day, unaware she had done anything wrong. They were small things, fragments of something he never understood. And now, sitting by the piano, watching the evening light spill across the lake, Thomas felt it clearly. The the past was not finished with him. Somewhere in those memories, hidden in laughter, in color, in roses, lay a truth he had missed all those years ago. He didn't yet know it. But soon the answer would come. And when it did, it would change everything. Morning light slipped through the thin curtains. A soft, golden patch rested on the wooden floor and on Thomas's tired face. He had barely slept. Memories kept rising, gentle at first, then sharp enough to wake him. The girl with wide eyes under the streetlight, her laughter, the trembling moment he knelt with a ring in his hand, and the silence that followed. A silence that lasted a lifetime. Thomas sat up slowly, breathing through the ache in his chest. It had been decades, but today it felt new, raw, unfinished. He dressed, stepped outside, and walked the familiar road back to the small flower shop. A bell chimed softly as he entered. The young woman behind the counter looked up. "Good morning," she said. "You're back." Thomas nodded, shy in a way that didn't match his age. "I wanted to ask about the roses you held yesterday. Those red ones. Bright red. Do you know where they came from?" Her face warmed. "Yes. They're from my family's garden. We've grown roses for generations. My aunt, she took care of them." A heartbeat. "Her name was Eleanor." Thomas froze, everything inside him stilled. "I knew her," he whispered. "A long time ago." The girl seemed to understand something without needing an explanation. "Would you like to see the garden?" she asked gently. The drive was quiet. Thomas watched the passing trees, old, tall, familiar, as if they remembered him too. When they arrived, he stepped out and inhaled deeply. The scent of roses, sweet, full, overwhelming, wrapped around him. And then he saw it, a small gravestone beneath an oak tree. The girl's voice softened. "She passed away in 2015, peacefully. She said this garden was her whole heart." Thomas's hands shook as he approached the stone. Eleanor Grace, 1945 to 2015. Her world was always full of color. He let out a trembling laugh. Of course she'd say that. Of course she would. The girl hesitated, then said quietly, "You know, my aunt never married." Thomas lifted his head, stunned. "What?" "She always said her heart was broken once, and she never recovered." He swallowed hard. "But she left me," he whispered. "She walked away without a word. I proposed to her. I filled the whole garden with red roses, because I thought red meant love. But when she saw them, she looked confused, cold, and the next morning she was gone." The girl inhaled sharply, as if something inside her clicked into place. "Mr. Thomas, my aunt didn't see red." Thomas blinked. "She... what?" "She was colorblind. Red looked green to her. She didn't tell many people. She thought it was embarrassing when she was young. If you filled the garden with red roses, she would have seen them as green, the color for friendship." A long silence. Then Thomas's voice broke, quiet, shattered. "She thought I was confessing friendship?" "Yes." "And she thought you were rejecting her, so she left before you could hurt her more." A sob escaped him, small, hoarse, swallowed by the rose-scented air. His fingers touched the cool stone. "All these years," he whispered, "she thought I didn't love her, and I thought she didn't love me." The girl knelt beside him, voice trembling. "She did love you. She told me. The man she once loved brought color into her life, even if she couldn't see it the way he did." Thomas closed his eyes. Tears slid down his cheeks, quiet, slow, like long-delayed rain. He brushed a rose blooming near the grave, a perfect, vivid red. A color Eleanor never saw, a color she misunderstood, a color that changed both their lives. "It was always red, Ellie," he whispered. "Always." He stayed there for a long time, breathing, remembering, forgiving, himself and her. When he finally rose, the girl offered her arm. He took it. Together they walked back through the garden, her legacy, the place where love had bloomed, faded, and returned again in a different shade. The afternoon rain arrived without warning. Thin sheets of water slid down the window of Thomas's small rental cabin, blurring the outside world into soft shapes. He sat at the old upright piano in the corner, its wood worn, its keys yellowed with time. The same piano he once played for Eleanor, the same bench she once sat on, humming along quietly, her shoulder brushing his. Back when both of them were young, hopeful, and foolish in the same ways. Thomas lifted a piece of folded paper from the music stand. Edges frayed, ink faded. It was a melody he and Eleanor had written together, or rather, started together. Half a song, half a confession neither of them ever found the courage to finish. He unfolded it slowly. The notes looked like tiny footprints, leading into a place he never reached. A soft, trembling breath escaped him. "If I had stayed..." His voice was barely a whisper. "Would you have stayed too?" He placed the paper back, pressing it carefully under the metal clip so it wouldn't flutter away. The room was warm, but Thomas felt cold. Not the kind of cold that comes from weather. The kind that settles in after years of wondering what if. He lowered the piano lid until only a thin line of ivory showed. His hands rested there, unmoving. Behind him, floorboards creaked softly. "Mr. Thomas?" Emily's voice, gentle, hesitant. He didn't turn immediately. He swallowed first, then straightened his back a little, forcing a smile before facing her. "Yes, sweetheart? Are you doing okay?" Her eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen more truth in the last 24 hours than she expected. Thomas exhaled slowly. A sound between a sigh and a release. "I'm all right," he said, a small smile warming the corners of his lips. "I just keep hearing that melody, the one we never finished. It still plays in my head, all these years. It never stopped." Emily stepped closer. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Then she simply placed her hand on his shoulder, a quiet gesture of comfort. The rain softened outside, fading into a whisper. Thomas touched the piano lid one last time, as if sealing a memory inside. Some love stories end, some drift, some crumble, and some simply echo, unfinished, waiting in the spaces between notes. Thomas whispered, almost to himself, "It never really went silent. Not once." A single note rang out, soft, pure, trembling in the still air, then faded into nothing. And this is where the story comes to an end. Not with answers to every question, but with the quiet understanding that some moments are never meant to be fixed. Sometimes, all it takes is a single misunderstanding. A moment too small to notice at the time, yet heavy enough to alter the course of an entire life. We spend years replaying the past, imagining different words, different choices, different endings. But the truth is, the past does not return. Time moves forward without asking for permission, and no matter how tightly we hold on to our pain, it never carries us back to where it began. So we learn, slowly, sometimes painfully, that healing is not about forgetting. It is about letting go of the guilt, letting go of the silence, letting go of the life we thought we were supposed to have. Because while the past remains a memory, the future still waits, quiet, open, and unfinished. And in that unfinished space, we choose to stand up, to breathe again, and to keep moving forward. Not because the pain disappears, but because life does not end where the story breaks.